Hi, I'm Renee Rosen, the author of Park Avenue Summer, and this is my Mr. Media interview.
One of the best novels I read in 2018 was Renee Rosen's Windy City Blues, in which she told the story of Chicago's legendary chess records through the eyes of a fictionalized young woman who worked at the nascent blues and rock and roll label. And even though she never existed in reality, you couldn't help but come away from reading the book feeling like she was flesh and blood. I had the same experience with Rosen's latest book, Park Avenue Summer. Once again, the author delivers up a slice of actual history by taking us through it in the persona of a young woman, named, this time, Alice Weiss. Rosen takes her readers back in time to the moment of 1965, when Cosmopolitan magazine is on the verge of shutting down, only to be saved against all logic by an inexperienced new editor named Helen Gurley Brown, best known as the controversial and provocative author of Sex and the Single Girl. Rosen's portrayal of Brown is incredible, as is her ability to capture an era that most of us know best through the eyes of TV's Don Draper in Mad Men. Now, if you ever watch that show, flip it on its ass and imagine it's the magazine industry instead of advertising, and that you're seeing the start of the swinging 60s and the sexual revolution through the eyes of women, not men. Now, I can't wait to find out what the author has planned for us next, but we'll talk about this book first. Renee Rosen, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. And, Renee, what are you doing to me? I mean, why am I at this point where I care and I'm actually rooting for these women in 1960s New York? What are you doing to me with these books?
It was a fascinating time, not just for women, but for men too, because as the women changed, the men changed too. They had to. So
they didn't change quite as quickly as the women did.
No. Still haven't, but,
I just have to think that would have been a brutal era to be a woman who wanted to be anything but a homemaker and a mom and stay at home. It was just the lack of respect, the treatment, all of it. It just seems awful. Why would anyone have wanted to go to work in that era?
They had to do something, as people like Helen Gurley Brown sort of opened the door for other women. They started to realize there's options out there. I don't have to just do what my mother and my grandmother did. But it was an uphill battle for women. Absolutely.
I guess the real question is, all the stories in the world that you could fall on. Why Helen Gurley Brown? How did she rise to your attention to devote a year and a half of your life to writing a book like this?
Well, actually, it started with I was going to just do I had been binge watching Mad Men, actually, and sort of fell in love with New York during that era, and so I thought that I wanted to find another industry that had some glamour to it, that I could sort of, advertising had been done. And so I started thinking about magazines, and I thought originally that I was going to just create a fictional magazine with fictional characters and just tell a story of a magazine that was going under and these women saving it, the secretaries basically coming to the charge and saving it. And as I was talking to my editor, it just sort of dawned on us that Helen Gurley Brown, Cosmo, and we both sort of got goosebumps and said, yeah, that's the story.
Had you ever met Brown? Had you ever seen her speak? Had you had any contact or experience with her?
Well, I was aware of Sex and the Single Girl, and I grew up reading Cosmo. I ran to the bedside astrologer and took my older sister's copies and poured over them. But I had never worked in magazines, so this was new territory for me too. But I did meet a woman who, Helen Gurley Brown, was really like a second mother to her. And Lois Cahill really sort of shared a lot of her stories about Helen. She knew her probably better than anyone. She vetted the book for me, and it was really just a research blessing.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Lois. Who is she? Was she? I don't know if she's still with us.
Yes.
She is. So who is she to Helen Gurley Brown that she could be described as kind of a, like a daughter to her? What's the connection and
They Lois met Helen Gurley Brown at Studio 54, and
that's funny because that's where I met Helen too.
Really?
No.
Well, Lois is like our age, so
Okay.
So she and Helen just became fast friends. Lois wrote to her, Helen always wrote back, and Helen just had this very close relationship with Lois, and always said, if I was going to have a daughter, it would have been you. And just they just had a very special bond.
What did Lois do for a living?
Lois is a writer, really accomplished writer, and she also runs the Palm Beach Writers Festival, literary festival every year.
Interesting. So would she? So there, I wanted to ask you because there's a lot of little things about Helen that you describe in the book. You talk about her in her office. She had a little tiny chair that she sat at. You write about her these crying jags that she would have, the little tiny bits of food that she would eat, all these kind of things that were incredible. Are these actual details? Or these come from Lois? Or are these invented details? It's one of those things where you wonder, where is real life and
right.
fiction?
So everything around Helen was fact. Based in fact. Lois was one that told me that she had this little doll's chair that she would hold her meetings in because she never wanted anyone to feel intimidated. She always wanted everyone to feel bigger than her, and everyone was bigger than her. She was a tiny woman. And she did eat her salads with her fingers, in the finest restaurants. She would just, sort of take a bite and always had runs in her stockings. That was just classic Helen. The one thing that Lois would probably disagree with, but I had seen it documented other places, was just the copious amounts of tears that Helen Gurley Brown would shed. She just was very emotional from all accounts that I could find. Maybe by the time Lois had met her, she was a little bit more seasoned and more, comfortable in her role. But, those early days at Cosmo where, no one really wanted her there. And, she was just terrified.
Well, and you speak to another part of the book that was so interesting in that Cosmo was basically a failing magazine. Hearst was a parent company. They were ready to kick it to the curb and be done with it. And this is the one thing that still I don't quite understand. You talk about in the book it was failing and that they wanted to be done with it, and yet somebody reached out and hired this woman to come in and do this. And she's the author of Sex and the Single Girl. So you know that there's something provocative about her. One thing I felt like I kind of missed, and maybe it went past me. Was there someone in the story who was that person at Hearst who was pushing for her, as opposed to all the guys who were pushing against her?
No, it was actually her husband, David Brown. Now, David Brown was a Hollywood movie producer.
Right.
He was the guy behind, went on to do Jaws and let's see, A Few Good Men. He did Valley of the Dolls. He also did the film version of Sex and the Single Girl. And he had also, before that, been an editor at Cosmopolitan. Now, Helen and David were shopping around a prototype of their own magazine called Femme. And, we have to put it into context, too. In 1962, she publishes this book, Sex and the Single Girl. And radio and TV hosts couldn't even say the title of the book over the air. It was so controversial. Hearst, everybody was terrified that she was going to turn Cosmopolitan into a copy of her book, which is exactly what she did. But I think that they were so certain that she was going to fail and the magazine would fold and go away. And I think that, coupled with the fact that David Brown was incredibly charismatic. He could sell ice cubes to Eskimos, and I think he just convinced them, take a chance on Helen, even though she's never worked at a magazine and has no editorial experience. But
yeah, and there's some great examples of that early on. She doesn't understand any of the language for the layouts of the pages and what's coming up, how the pages work, the deadline. I mean, nothing. She literally, you capture that really well as someone who has worked in magazines, not at that level, but has worked in publishing. And I just thought, oh my God, how do you get thrown into this? And then you have all these forces, including, sadly, women who were working against her as well. Women were like, oh, no, we don't want that. We don't want her to do that. I kept thinking maybe there was a spouse of someone at Hearst who was like, maybe she could do something with it. But it was really kind of her and David against the world, wasn't it?
Yeah. And he was, definitely her silent partner. He wrote a lot of the cover blurbs, and she, as fiercely independent as she was, and she was a feminist, she still really relied on David.
Yeah, that comes across real strong. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, we can see pretty clearly her attraction to him. What is his attraction to her? I don't mean to say that uncharitably, but...
No, ironically, David was the one that told her to write the book, Sex and the Single Girl, after they were married. She was married. At 37, he said, you were the most fascinating single girl I'd ever dated. And he's a Hollywood producer. He dated all these starlets. And Helen always referred to herself as a mouse burger. I think she was always much more attractive than she, wanted people to think. But I think she was just, she was very clever. She was so fiercely independent. And I think that was just refreshing. And, she also really reeled him in very strategically. She saved all her money. She was one of the first copywriters. In fact, Peggy Olson in Mad Men was based on Helen Gurley Brown. And she paid for a Mercedes with cash. So she was driving around in a Mercedes, and, none of David's starlets could have afforded a car like that or had their own apartment. And so, he found that all very exciting that, she didn't need a man, but she was just refreshing to him.
And I know that Helen has passed. Is David's passed as well?
Yeah. He passed away a few years before her.
Okay. And they never did have children.
He had children from a previous marriage, but she didn't.
So there's no child or anyone who's come around saying, no, that's not her. That's not her. Have you had, on the other hand, people who knew her who've come? I know the book officially isn't out for another 2 weeks as we're recording this, but are you getting feedback from people who knew her or knew of her? And
I have heard from a few people who worked in the industry during that time period, magazines, and so far, it seems like we got it pretty right. And then people have told me, I met her. A lot of people met her in the elevator going up, to the floors in Hearst. And I did interview a couple people who had known her, either, nobody quite as in the same light that Lois knew her, but people who had worked with her or did an article for her or something like that.
And I wanted to ask you more about the research. So clearly there had to be a lot of research here, and I wondered if a lot of it is from interviewing people, or is it from reading about the era, reading the did you go through and read like piles of Cosmos from the era? I mean, how do you do a research for a project like this?
I always start with the thing that was interesting was there had been a lot of nonfiction written about Helen Gurley Brown. I believe it was in 2016 or 2017, two really great biographies on her were published. One was Enter Helen, the other was Not Pretty Enough. So I sort of started there just to get a foundation. And also, part of the reason of introducing Alice as the narrator was to make it a different story than what was already out there. To still tell Helen's story, but give it a different context. So I usually start with nonfiction. There's a lot of really great videos and interviews with Helen. You can find them all over the internet. And then I went to New York, and you know, tough job, but I had to go to, the Russian Tea Room and the St. Regis and the Plaza and, all these all the haunts that were Helen's haunts. But I also went by where Helen, her very first apartment with David, and, she rode the bus every day to work. So I went to her bus stop and, followed her path of how she would have gone to work, because at that time they were not in her tower. Cosmo was in a separate building down on 57th Street. So, and I, just like Alice first arrives in New York, I went to Port Authority and just, let the chaos sort of wash over me and try to get a feel of what would that be like to be, a Midwestern girl just landing in the city. So I did a lot of hands-on research like that, but then meeting Lois was really a bonus, definitely.
Oh, you just gave me a massive flashback. I grew up, my grandfather worked for a bus company that commuted between New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Port Authority. So probably once a month at least all through my childhood, we would be on a bus going into Port Authority. So when you talked about a Midwest girl, I saw a lot of those kids arriving.
Just wide-eyed and
and it as many times.
Because it's a maze there. There's so many different levels and
then it changed years later. They rebuilt the whole thing. Oh, it was insane. And then you step outside on the street and everybody's screaming and yelling and the cabs are honking at you. And in that era, maybe a little after that, 42nd Street close by, and all the adult stuff going on, and it was insane. Plus, it smelled so bad in those days. Oh my God. So let's talk a little about Alice Weiss, who is the invented character in all this. You have to create a backstory for her. You have to gingerly squeeze her into actual events. And some actual events and some things that you can concoct based on the historical record. Part of what I think was quite charming is that you really created a whole life for Alice. She wasn't just incidental to the book, to telling Helen's story. We get Helen's story, and I think I've given evidence here of the great detail. But Alice's story was pretty interesting too. Does she have her roots in anyone you know, or anyone you've met, or Lois, I guess?
You know what? Surprisingly, and I didn't realize this when I was writing it, but there's probably a little of me. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, had always had this fantasy about living in New York. And I did. I moved there, lived there for about a year, got homesick for Chicago and came back. But I still have these fantasies of moving back to New York. There's something magical about that place. That aspect of, this young girl from the Midwest, wanting to be in New York, that probably came more out of my own desires than I even realized when I was writing it. As for all the other layers with her family, and because she has definitely her own story in the book, I really have to say that came from working with an amazing editor who kept saying, drill down. She kept saying, we got to crack Alice. We got to crack, what does Alice want? And it was through all those, and we really worked on that. Like, who is she? What does she want? What brings her here just beyond, I want to be in New York. And, she's really seeking a mother figure. It's right there very early on in the book, so I'm not giving anything away, that, her mother's passed away. And I think, she kind of looks to Helen in a way as like a big sister and as a mother figure. But, she definitely goes there, and I think transforms as a result of being so closely aligned to Helen Gurley Brown, who really opens her eyes to a whole different world.
Well, I got to challenge you on something. Does she really see Helen as the mother figure, or is it? And I can't think of the character's name.
Elaine Sloan.
Yeah, it seemed like more like she turned to her as a mother figure because of the connection that she actually had to Alice's mother.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Elaine is a friend of her mother's who works at Bernard Geiss Associates, which was the publishing house that published Sex and the Single Girl as well as Valley of the Dolls. And there's a whole story in and of itself under that publishing house. But that's a fair observation. I think she did look to Elaine in that way. But I think that Helen also opened her eyes, to what her possibilities were in the romantic sense, I'll say.
The Don Juans. Yes.
Yes. She warned her about those Don Juans.
Yeah, it's interesting because when Alice, and I obviously want to be careful not to give too much away, but when Alice shows up at Helen's office, at that point, you could see that she's thinking, Helen could teach her and she'll learn and this will be great. But really, it involves, she becomes more the mother to Helen in a lot of ways. Someone who's looking out for Helen, who's more of Helen's protector. She's kind of like what David is off hours, Alice is to Helen during work hours.
Yeah. And I'll tell you where that came from. A friend of mine had been Oprah's personal assistant for many, many years. And we had worked together in another place where she was the owner's personal assistant. And I saw the way she took care of this woman. And I mean, she's all hands on. And if you've got her behind you, you don't have to worry about anything. You need a cup of coffee, a pencil, a reservation. You're throwing a party at the 11th hour. She would do it. And I thought of, that Alice would take that kind of care of Helen. Because she also believed in what Helen was trying to do. She didn't always agree with what her messages were or, some of her approaches, but she did want to see her succeed.
How does Helen hold up to some of the other women we know from the women's magazines over the years? I'll probably butcher her name. I'm thinking Anna Wintour.
Anna Wintour. I think that, Anna Wintour, well, first of all, she was, Helen was already well into her career before Anna Wintour, I think had even worked at a magazine. But Helen really ruled and guided that magazine with a very gentle touch. She really believed in respecting people and pulling the best out of them. So she was never a bully. If anything, she was very self-deprecating because she wanted to sort of level the playing field and put people at ease because she felt that was how you got the best out of them. And, she discovered a lot of and nurtured a lot of talent along the way. There was Nora Ephron and Judith Krantz and Rona Jaffe wrote for her. And, I think that her approach would be to catch more flies with honey. And, she was a gentle soul. I mean, she would get upset and, screech like a bird, but, but I think that she definitely believed in empowering people and in helping women along to get to, what their next goal was. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think it did.
Okay.
And you avoided saying anything bad about Anna Wintour, so good on you for that. Not that I was fishing for that. I just want to be clear. I have no nothing in that race. So these two books, and I know these aren't your only books, but these two books that I have read both have this similar thread, that the invented woman taking us into a legendary cultural place in American history. You are, from what you told me before we went on the air, you are on deadline on the next book. Are you able to talk at all about what you're working on?
Sure, yeah. It's called The Social Graces, and it is the story of Mrs. Astor and Alva Vanderbilt vying for control of New York society during the Gilded Age. And it's slated to come out January 2021. So.
And is there a common thread here again? Will we have a character who takes us through it, or is it?
It really is sticking pretty closely to Caroline, Astor, and Alva Vanderbilt. And there's a third character, but I can't say who that is. I know, but I can't. I don't want to give that away. But that material is so rich. No pun intended, but it's so it's just so wonderful. All their little etiquettes and the balls that they threw and all. I didn't find there's a few fictional characters, but they're very secondary. It's sort of like I did another book, which was What the Lady Wants, and that was about Marshall Field and his 30-year love affair with his neighbor. And that was another book that there were a few cameo fictional characters that I needed for a story device, but really it was their story.
I think I just nailed why I enjoy these books so much. And this goes way back. I hadn't thought about this in years. In the mid-1970s, remember the John Jakes books about the bicentennial?
Oh, yeah.
The Bastard and that's the only thing I can remember.
Yeah.
And that was it was a similar literary device where he took decades of American history, and each book was like 600 or 700 pages. Yeah. It was insane. But he created a family, I think, as if I recall correctly, that goes through the entire American history, and we see it through their eyes. They were not real, but all the events that happened were real. And I don't know why I just thought of this, but I remember I read those books just like candy, just like I'm reading your books. Thanks.
That's what I love about historical fiction, though. You get to learn about, and writing it, I get to go and discover and research something that I knew nothing about or very little about. So it's a great journey.
Well, I think last question, as we're sitting here, for people who are getting to watch this on video, over your right shoulder, there is a photo of a very distinguished-looking gentleman, and I have to ask you who that is.
Oh, this guy right here.
Yeah, who is that?
That's my father. Oh, nice. That is R.W. In fact, this was his pinky ring. I wear it all the time. Okay. My father was larger than life. In fact, my very first book, Every Crooked Pot, was a love letter to my father of what it was like growing up as his daughter, because we never knew what to expect. He was a real character.
Neat. It looks like a very handsome fellow from the photo. So
it was
good picture. Yeah, nice.
So I miss him every day.
Oh, nice. Well, folks, listen. You can find Renee Rosen's latest novel, Park Avenue Summer, in great stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. If you're watching on YouTube, just below the video, you'll see a link to order the book. You can click on that. If you're watching on MrMedia.com or listening on MrMedia.com, you'll see the cover of the book. You can go and click on that. It'll take you to Amazon. You can order the book right now. You can get it as a download on your Kindle, or you can, they have those drones that can get you the book in like 30 minutes, I hear. Don't hold me to that, but that's just what I hear. Renee, you've still got ReneeRosen.com, I believe?
Absolutely.
And active in social media?
Yes, and for any book club people, I'm happy to Skype in and visit, so love to meet with people that way.
Oh, that's new. I hadn't heard that one before. Okay, interesting. Well, Renee, I adore your work. I'm so glad we got to talk again. And,
me too. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, so much for joining us, Mr. Media, today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Turn your back on the deceiver. It's a bad idea to believe her. A bad idea to believe her. Turn up the stereo receiver. Turn up the stereo receiver.